Hello there, I'm Sashi Sivram Krishna and welcome to my course Macroeconomics, a Modern Money Theory Perspective. We are in part 1 of the course Macroeconomics and Money. In our last lecture of this part, lecture 27, we will look at modern money in a four-sector economy. Our analysis of modern money throughout this course will utilize balance sheets and T accounts of four sectors of the economy, namely the government, the central bank, commercial banks, and finally the non-bank private sector, or what we would call as NBPS. The NBPS comprises mainly of households and firms. However, in some discussions, we will also introduce a non-bank financial sector comprising of institutions like primary dealers, PDs, or perhaps NBFCs. So let me begin by presenting the abridged balance sheets of each of the four sectors. In reality, these balance sheets are far more complex in the sense that they have many more components, both assets and liabilities. But this abridged version really is what is required for our purposes in understanding money and monetary flows. So beginning with the government in a modern money economy, the typical assets of the government would include deposits, which are held both at the central bank as well as commercial banks. Now, these are financial assets of the government and therefore are reflected as financial liabilities in the balance sheets of the central bank as well as commercial bank. On the liability side of the government's balance sheet would be bonds issued, and these might be possessed by the central bank or even by the private sector. And these are once again financial liabilities and therefore they become the financial assets of other entities in the economy. Now, it is well possible that as the government spends, it exhausts its deposits and might not really get any assets, physical assets or otherwise in return for these deposits. They might be merely transfer payments made to the private sector, the non-bank private sector, and so on. So the balance sheet of the government can actually turn negative in the sense that we might end up with a negative net worth. But this should not worry us because, as we said, the government is different from the other players in the economy, especially the private sector, because it's the issuer of currency and not a user of currency like the private sector. So this must be kept in mind, that when we see a negative net worth on the government's balance sheet, it doesn't really imply insolvency or bankruptcy, simply because the government can never become bankrupt in its own currency. It can always create new money to pay off its debts. So this is a vital and a crucial point that must be borne in mind as we use these balance sheets to understand macroeconomics as well as macroeconomic policies, especially fiscal and monetary policies conducted by the state. Now, descending down the hierarchy of monetary institutions, that is when we begin from the top and start descending along this hierarchy, we come to central banks. Central banks are essentially a state institution and must be seen as such. The primary assets of the central bank are government securities and bonds. Now, in the 2008 post-2008 world, after the global financial crisis happened and the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, bought toxic assets off the balance sheets of banks, commercial banks, the Federal Reserve began to hold even private sector securities. But this was not a phenomenon that was common in the pre-2008 world, but is something that we might now see happening, especially after the pandemic. There is another important asset that one can actually should include in the case of a central bank's balance sheet are the foreign exchange reserves. But I have not included it here explicitly so that I do not complicate the balance sheet at this stage. Of course, we will introduce it later in one of the parts of the course. If you go to the liability side of the central bank, the deposits of the government would be one of the main liabilities of the central bank. Like I said, these deposits are the financial assets of the government, but they appear as the financial liabilities of the central bank. Reserves are essentially the deposits of commercial banks held by the central bank. And they're this called reserves, but you can think of it as a kind of deposit that the central bank holds and which belongs in a sense as a financial asset to the commercial banks. These reserves are required for interbank settlements, and they are also sometimes referred to as liquidity. The central bank also, on its liabilities side, a financial liability would be cash, and these are the promissory notes, that the currency that you hold in your wallet. They appear as financial assets to the private sector, but they are the financial liabilities of the central bank. So this is a typical central bank balance sheet that we will utilize to make a certain analysis of money and monetary flows. Descending down the hierarchy of monetary institutions, we now come to commercial banks. If we look at the assets of commercial banks, they would include reserves as well as bonds. Reserves are nothing but the balances held by commercial banks at the central bank. They are the financial assets of commercial banks, but they are the financial liabilities of the central bank. These financial liabilities are required by the commercial banks in order to settle interbank claims, which means that when one bank has to transfer an amount of money to another bank, it must do so only using reserve money, the promissory notes of the central bank. And therefore all banks will have to have a stipulated amount of reserve balances on their balance sheet. The commercial banks would also have to hold bonds. These are government securities as an important constituent of their balance sheet, in the sense that these are highly regulated and the government would insist that a certain percentage of their deposits, of their liabilities, be held in the form of bonds. Commercial banks would have other assets. For example, they might hold foreign exchange, they might hold property, but we are not showing those on the balance sheet as they're not so important right now, at least to understand money and monetary flows. The liabilities, financial liabilities of the commercial banks are the deposits which belong to the non-bank private sector. So those would be the deposits or the financial assets of the non-bank private sector, but the financial liabilities of commercial banks. Now, when we want to transact between ourselves in the non-bank private sector, for example, if we buy and sell goods and services between ourselves, exchange, for example, I buy some rice or some wheat from you, then I can issue a check in your favor. But that essentially is using the financial liabilities of the bank, promissory notes of the bank, to settle transactions or claims which arise from transactions between ourselves in the non-bank private sector. And in quite the same way, the banks, commercial banks, use the promissory notes or the financial liabilities of the central bank, reserve money, to settle claims between banks, interbank settlements of claims. So this is really the essence of modern money that we must keep in mind. Finally, descending to the bottom of the hierarchy of monetary institutions, we come to the non-bank private sector, or NBPS. The assets of the non-bank private sector include deposits. These are financial assets of the non-bank private sector and the financial liabilities of commercial banks. Cash, once again the financial assets of the non-bank private sector, but the financial liabilities of the central bank. Bonds, which are the financial assets of the non-bank private sector, but the financial liabilities of the government. We also have physical assets. For example, automobiles, property, houses, gold, silver, plant and equipment owned by corporate enterprises, and so on. But please remember that physical assets do not appear as liabilities in the balance sheets of other entities. On the liability side of the non-bank private sector's balance sheet, we have net worth. The non-bank private sector should have a positive net worth, implying that it's not insolvent. However, in a flow sense, when we look at T accounts, it is possible that for a short period of time, and this could be maybe for a decade, that the non-bank private sector is actually accumulating more liabilities than accumulating more assets. But this is only in terms of changes in the balance sheet. This accumulation of net financial liabilities could mean leveraging by the private sector. But the private sector is not an issuer of currency, and over time it must begin to deleverage and pay back these additional liabilities which have been accumulated for an extended period of time. But this is possible, but in the flow sense of the term, and when we look at the T accounts. You might wonder why we have kept out loans from the liability side of the non-bank private sector. Now, when we look at intra non-bank private sector loans, these would net out to zero, meaning that if I take a loan from you, then I am accumulating a liability, you are accumulating a financial asset. These would cancel out or net out to zero, and therefore we do not show them explicitly in the balance sheet of the entire sector. But you might ask the question, why are we not showing the loans that the non-bank private sector takes from commercial banks? After all, these should appear just like deposits. However, for many analysis that we would be carrying out, we do not really need this to be shown. It's only a matter of convenience that we do not show it, but it is very likely that you might want to do so. Just for the sake of being complete, you might want to show loans taken from commercial banks as a liability of the non-bank private sector. These are from commercial banks, which appear then as assets on the commercial bank's balance sheet. So this is quite possible and likely, but we are not doing it for the sake of convenience in order to keep the balance sheets as simple as possible. The other reason why we do not show it is because at times we look at the non-government sector as a independent sector, which is a combination of both commercial banks as well as the non-bank private sector. So when we take the entire non-government sector, then these would also net out to zero. The loans taken by the non-bank private sector from commercial banks would also net out to zero. Nonetheless, we continue to show deposits on both the balance sheets. So please remember that this is done only for the sake of convenience and to keep the balance sheets as simple as possible for the specific purposes that we wish to analyze and so on. But we are not showing complete balance sheets, and so as and when we need to highlight certain transactions, certain items on the balance sheets, we will do so. In case we have to include more items on balance sheets, we can even do that. But this is just to give you a broad picture of the different balance sheets of what we have defined as the four sectors of the economy. And like we mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, we might break these down into more sectors, like to include, for instance, non-bank financial companies, or maybe primary dealers, and so on. But we will use the balance sheet approach to understand money and monetary flows emanating from government policies, fiscal as well as monetary policies, and how they affect balance sheets of different sectors, and thereby we can also understand how they affect the financial asset holding position of these sectors, as well as how they impact the financial liabilities of these sectors. So with this, we end part 1 of the course, and we begin in our next lecture with part 2 of the course, which is about fiscal policy.